Good morning. My name is Dave. I'm a member of the Carlton 10 a.m. congregation, and it's my privilege to bring you this week's Bible reading, which is taken from the book of Exodus, starting at chapter 15, verse 22, to the end of chapter 16. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they travelled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There, the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening, and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left, and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white, like coriander seed, and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna 40 years, until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. An omer is 1/10 of an ephah.
Morning, everyone. In the early days of manned space missions, Soviet cosmonauts were returning to Earth in a rough state. As they emerged from their capsules, they did so with dizziness, with high pulse rates, with irregular heart rhythms. Their muscles were wasting away on their bones. They couldn't walk for a week, and even after a month, they were still undergoing intensive therapy for atrophied muscles and weakened hearts. See, at zero gravity in space, the muscles of the body, including the heart, begin to waste away because there's no resistance. And so the Soviet scientists developed what they called the penguin suit, a whole body suit full of elastic bands which created resistance for the muscles to work against. Without their muscles being tested, they wasted away. And today, as we open up the book of Exodus together, we're going to see God carefully build his own penguin suit for his people. If you were with us early last year, you might remember our Exodus series where we worked through chapters 1 to 15 of Exodus together, recounting the amazing story of God's deliverance of his people from slavery in Egypt. That story in chapter 15 came to the climax of God's people looking back over the Red Sea at the scene of God's victory over Pharaoh and his army. Exodus 1 to 15 was a story of deliverance. And now the rest of the book, from chapter 15 through to 40, is a story of God bringing his people to worship him. As God called Pharaoh over and over, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." Now that they've been let go, God will bring them to serve him. See, as God delivered them from Egypt, Israel were being brought out from an external threat to their relationship with God. But now Israel will be brought in as God deals with the internal threat to their relationship with him. And the big question of this series as we explore together over the next couple of months, the big question of Exodus 15 to 40 is, how can a sinful people come into a covenant relationship with a holy God? How can a sinful people come into a covenant relationship with a holy God? That's the big question of this series as we work through Exodus together. And so as God's people, as Israel stand by the shore of the Red Sea and look back over God's victory, freeing them from 400 years of slavery, that moment was like a TV series finale, a peak moment in this narrative. And the next peak moment in the narrative will come at an actual peak at Mount Sinai, where God will give the law to his people, where he will enter into a covenant relationship with them. It's perhaps the most significant and identity-forming moment for the life of this nation will happen at Mount Sinai. And so between these two moments, between the Red Sea and Mount Sinai, in Exodus chapters 15 to 18, what we see is a series of stories of God preparing his people and preparing their leader Moses to enter the covenant relationship. There are 3 stories of God testing his people, and then a story of God showing his love for his people by delivering them from an enemy, and then a final story of God preparing and equipping Moses as leader of his people using Moses' father-in-law Jethro. And this little group of stories here between Exodus 15 and 18, they represent God forming his people, preparing their hearts to be his covenant people, his treasured possession. And this morning, we're going to focus on the first story in this little group, the first of the 3 testing stories in chapter 15, verses 22 to 27. It was the first part of what David read for us. So God leads his people from the Red Sea into the desert, and they walk through the desert for 3 days. 3 days walking in the desert is a long time, right? The little ones are starting to struggle. People's thirst is becoming desperate. But at last, they see water ahead of them. And as they rush to drink, their faces turn to disgust as they realize the water is bitter. It's Mara. And by this Mara bitter water, the Mara hearts of the Israelites flow out in grumbling against Moses and against God. They say, "What are we to drink?" How quickly they have forgotten the God who moved an ocean for them. How then does God respond to their lack of faith? Not with anger, not with his own Mara bitterness, but with patience, with all the patience of a Bunnings employee with an anti-masker. He responds to their bitterness with blessing. Have a look at verse 25. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Now, the Hebrew word here translated piece of wood is the word etz, which literally means tree. It's a word for tree. And there's a whole web of fascinating connections here that we could explore about why God chose to bring about this blessing through this etz, through this piece of wood. And in the surrounding stories, God makes the same choice to use Moses' staff, a related image. It's an image that links all the way back to the tree in the Garden of Eden, through which God blesses and gives life to his people, the tree of life. God responds to the bitterness of his people's hearts with blessing, with Eden-like blessing. This is a God of grace, nurturing and training his people. And then in verse 26, as God himself reflects on his act of blessing for his people, we see what it is that God is achieving here, why he led them to these bitter waters in the desert. Have a look at verse 26. There, the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." See, God is using this episode to test Israel. This piece of wood, this etz tree at the water of Marah, it isn't only God's instrument of blessing, right? It's also God's instrument of testing. Back in Eden, that the tree of life stood next to the tree of knowing good and evil, the tree of testing. He says to them, "If you listen to me and keep my commands, I will continue to bring you this blessing. See what I've done for you here. That's what relationship with me looks like. I am the Lord who gives life, who heals." God's giving them a foretaste, a glimpse of the covenant relationship which is soon to come, right? He's preparing them for that moment. This statement here from God, this call to obedience and promise of blessing, it anticipates the much fuller expression of this relationship which the covenant will soon represent for them. If God's people obey and worship him, he will continue to bring them the abundant blessing he is already showing them. Having tested them and having exposed the bitterness of their hearts and then responded with blessing and a call to obedience, God doubles down on his blessing to them. This glimpse of Eden in the piece of wood is supersized, it's upgraded into the experience of the Israelites at Elim in verse 27, where they camp by 12 springs of water, sweet, not bitter. There's one for each tribe and a 70 palm trees. It's a picture of the blessing of being with God. It's a picture of the blessings of covenant relationship. It's a picture of Eden. This is a testing story. It's a story of God testing his people and preparing their hearts. And as I've spent time in this passage this week, I've wrestled with the question, why does God test his people? Why does God test his people? Why does God test us? Does God not know what they will do in the situation of testing? Is he trying to get a quick update on where they're at? Does he test them? Does he test us to assign a grade to our faith, or just in some kind of arbitrary way to see what will happen? No, that's not what God is like. That's not the God that we worship. See, if there's one thing that stands out from this testing story and from the two testing stories that are paired with it in this section of Exodus, it is the intentional and expert and patient grace that God expresses, testing his people to grow them. It's for them. God's testing of his people, God's testing of us, is an expression of his intimate and perfect and fatherly and enduring love. In each of these three stories here, God leads his people through the desert deliberately into a situation of need and testing. It's no coincidence that they come to these bitter waters in the desert. And in each of these three stories, the people grumble against Moses, which is against God, And Moses cries out to God, and God graciously responds by providing for their needs in precisely such a way to teach them about who he is and what it means to trust him. We see what he reveals about himself here. In the second story, we see him give them the Sabbath rest in providing manna and quail. And in the third story, we see God again teaching them about himself as he streams forth blessing as water to them. And each story ends with Israel having that glimpse of Eden, that glimpse of covenant blessing and rest with God, which he's trying to show them is to come. It's an expertly crafted series of stories. It's an expertly crafted section of scripture authored to show us that God tests his people to grow our faith in him. God's testing is for us. It's hard to say that at the moment though, right? It's hard to see that when you and I are going through an experience of testing unlike any that we've been through before. For some of us, perhaps the most painful test we've ever experienced. Every day feels like a test, waking up to monotony and to anxiety, to loneliness. Every Zoom call feels like a test, right? The only way to communicate with the people that you love is at the same time another exhausting hour in front of the laptop. Every Sunday feels like a test. Logging on to watch church, being reminded that we're not here together, not being able to hear your brothers and sisters sing. We're not hugging each other. It's a test, but friends, don't despair. Our God is working all things for the good of those who love him. God's loving, deliberate strengthening of his people through testing is hard. It's really hard. These Israelites, these are stateless people. They're nomads wandering in the desert, living hand to mouth. They're unable to even provide food or water for themselves. Right, their test isn't panic buying pasta. Their test is going hungry. God has brought them to the brink. And it's exactly where he's going to make his power known in their weakness. The great preacher Charles Spurgeon, he wrote about this passage, Israel gained by education. The Lord was not going to lead a mob of slaves into Canaan to go and behave like slaves there. They had to be tutored. The wilderness was the Oxford and Cambridge for God's students. There they went to university. There he taught and trained them. There they took their degree before they entered the promised land. There is no university for a Christian like that of sorrow and trial. Do you see God the teacher, God the trainer, God the guide in this story? I love seeing God at work here. He's so intentional and patient and gracious with his people. He is an expert coach, taking his team through drills carefully designed to test them, to grow their skills, to stretch their trust. He's an experienced teacher, crafting learning tasks to engage students right at their level, extending their knowledge and their wisdom. He is a patient counsellor, asking just the right questions of his people to identify their areas of struggle and growth and change. I've seen God doing this in my heart, this testing work, even in the last few weeks. I found through the first wave of the pandemic and through the first season of lockdown, I found myself more distracted from God, more likely to have my mind occupied with daily case numbers or with Tiger King on Netflix than with God. But slowly, gently, God's been working on my heart, showing me that the futility and the waste of time that those things are compared to being with him. He's been calling my heart to draw closer to his. And I feel more desperate, more need for God's comfort and nearness and word than I did before. God's been doing that work in me through this time of testing. The writer J.I. Packer, who recently went home to God, wrote, "When we walk along a clear road, feeling fine, and someone takes our arm to help us, likely we would impatiently shake them off. But when we are caught in rough country in the dark, with a storm brewing and our strength spent, and someone takes our arm to help us, we would thankfully lean on him." The God who tests his people at the waters of Marah is the same God who tests his people throughout the drama of Scripture and throughout history. And he does it for their good and for his glory. See, faith grows like a muscle, right? By being tested and being stretched, not by being rested and passive. And God is our great personal trainer. You know these personal trainers, right? They look like they've come straight off the cover of a fitness magazine. They're wandering around in the gym like one giant protein shake. And they give you a goal to strain every muscle in your body to the point that it can't strain anymore, just to lift a weight which they use as a warm-up. If you have a personal trainer setting how much weight and watching how much weight you can lift, they're not doing it for their sake, right? They're not going to be impressed by how much weight you can lift. It's for your sake that they're testing you. And it's for our sake that God tests us. Hear these words from James chapter 1. "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything." The purpose of testing is for us. God doesn't need to check whether we still trust him. He tests us, as James 1 says, to produce perseverance in us. And that's how God brings us to maturity and completeness, by producing perseverance in us through trials. And so James comforts us and assures us we can consider our trials, our tests, pure joy. Right? Not bitterness, but joy. Not anger, but trust. Not futile, but transforming. Not disbelief, but faith. So friends, don't lose heart. Don't lose heart. Every moment of loneliness, every moment of fear, every moment of frustration, every moment where you feel like you just can't get through another moment, in the hands of our God who heals us, that very moment is a moment of power, of transformation, a moment of God's love, a moment for joy. Our Jesus is the one who comes for the brokenhearted, for the captives, for those who mourn. He comes to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. That's our Jesus. And he's the one whose own testing achieved salvation for us. In the garden, he was alone and afraid. In his trial, he was victimized and disempowered. By the soldiers, he was ridiculed and beaten. And yet, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, to win salvation for you and for me. In Jesus' moment of greatest testing, God was working with greatest power. And in your moment of greatest testing, God is working in great power in you and through you. Sometimes your personal trainer will design an exercise for you with the goal of muscle failure. Right? Instead of giving you a certain number of reps, you just keep lifting the weight until your muscles literally can't do it anymore. And the point is, to really grow a muscle, it has to be pushed to the very brink. And that's what God does to our faith. He pushes it to the very brink to stretch it, to grow it, to strengthen it. Because He is more committed to growing your faith even than you are. In your moment of greatest testing, God is working in great power in you and through you. Tests are for the future as well, right? When God tests His people here in the wilderness, He's doing it with a particular future in mind for them. He's preparing them for the covenant at Sinai. At the bitter waters here of Marah, he's preparing them to take delight in the sweetness of His law. He caused them to hunger and then fed them with manna to teach them that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. He split the rock in the wilderness and gave them water as abundant as the seas, to prove to them that blessings flow from His hands like rivers. And He tests us now to produce in us perseverance, making us mature and complete. It can feel really hard at the moment to imagine what the future is going to look like for ourselves and for our society and for our church. And so I want to finish by imagining together what we might not yet be able to see even for some time, that the perseverance and the mature faith that God is working in us through this test. I'm going to imagine this future for myself, and I hope that you might imagine it for yourself as well with me. I am longing for a day. I am waiting for the day when this pandemic is long past and its details begin to fade in memory. But the heart change and transformation that God worked in me through it continues to shape and drive my life. I'm longing for the day when we can meet together again in person as before, but it's different. When we're a community of people coming together every week, desperate to know God's nearness and comfort and power in our lives, people who are saturated in prayer, forged in long days and months of crying out to God for relief. I'm longing for the day when I cherish every opportunity to love and bless and serve my church community in all the ways that I can't now. For the day when I am quick to tell someone I love them, when I'm quick to hug people, when I'm quick to serve. For the day when I notice people who are isolated and lonely because I've been there. And when I am quick and committed to helping them and serving them to know the love of God in His people. I'm longing for the day when I can take my place in this family of believers here in this place, loving and serving and blessing one another with all the gifts and joy that God gives us. I'm longing for the day when I don't let my phone distract me from my time with God anymore, because I have spent too much time online and I know it does not satisfy. For the day when every moment I can spend with God is a joy, when every day I long for my times in His Word and in prayer, taking precious moments of Sabbath retreat to be with Him. I'm longing for the day when my church family is full of excited new believers, people who searched for meaning and hope when their life was turned upside down by COVID and found it in Jesus. I cannot wait for their desperate and infectious enthusiasm to reach the world with the gospel of Jesus, to bless our society in its recovery, to exercise the kind of faith that was birthed and forged in trial. I'm longing for the day when I am fearless to take risks for Jesus, because I know in a way I never knew before that the things of this world are passing away. For a day when the temptations to middle-class stability and comfort are less seductive than they used to be, because I've seen through them. And now I really know that the only way to truly find life is to lose it for Jesus. I am longing for the day when I get to gather here with a community of young believers at Uni Church who know the same, whose lives aren't driven by career or by achievement, but by an enduring passion to see the gospel of Jesus go to the ends of the earth. A community of vibrant and resilient young gospel missionaries to Melbourne and the world, mature and humble and formed in a way that the ones who came before them could never have dreamed. That's what I'm longing for. That's the kind of perseverance and maturity and completeness that I pray God is working for now. God is bringing about for us through this test. And if you're looking for that kind of day as well, if you long for a day like I do, then consider it joy as we face this test now. Because our God is moving in power. He's testing us, and it's for our good.